Tasha Wright stepped into the courtroom, her heels clicking softly against the worn tile floor. She was no stranger to the system, but today felt different. There was an uneasiness in her chest, a quiet tension that seemed to buzz in the air. Her dark eyes scanned the room, taking in the polished wood paneling, the rows of empty chairs, the cold, indifferent atmosphere that always hung over these places. Tasha knew why she was here. It was a simple matter, really. A minor fine for an overlooked paperwork issue related to her nonprofit organization. Still, the weight of it gnawed at her. She wasn't just any ordinary person in the courtroom today. She was Tasha Wright, director of a nationwide food security program, Project Nourish, that had fed thousands of families over the years. Yet here she was, waiting her turn just like everyone else. Her thoughts drifted for a moment, recalling the late nights spent organizing drives, the countless phone calls to donors, the hours in the field helping communities access nutritious meals. There were days when she felt like the work she did wasn't recognized enough, even though she built a program that was truly making a difference. But today the issue was small, an administrative mix-up that had led to a fine she hadn't even been aware of until the notice arrived. Tasha was determined to handle this with grace. She had dealt with bureaucratic hurdles before, always trying to keep her personal emotions in check, especially when navigating systems that were so often indifferent to the struggles of people like her. Her program, aimed at fighting hunger in underserved areas, was seen by many as a lifeline. But to others, she was just another face in a crowd, a woman to be judged based on what they saw in front of them. Judge Thomas Hughes entered the room, his black robe swishing as he moved to his seat. He was a man who had spent decades in the courtroom, confident in his decisions, accustomed to making quick calls on cases that seemed, to him, straightforward. Tasha had never been in his court before, but she had heard about him, how he was known for his no-nonsense attitude and swift verdicts. As he looked over his docket, his gaze fell on Tasha, and without much acknowledgement, he called her case. The judge barely glanced at her paperwork before issuing the fine. $500. You can pay it in full by next week, Ms. Wright, he said briskly, not giving her a chance to explain. His tone was final, as if the decision had already been made in his mind. Tasha felt a rush of frustration. She hadn't even had the opportunity to speak, to explain the circumstances. The fine seemed disproportionate, unnecessary. But the judge had already moved on. The case closed in his eyes. Tasha stepped out of the courtroom, her mind racing. The cold air hit her as she walked down the courthouse steps, but it couldn't shake the feeling that had settled in her chest, a feeling that this fine was more than just an inconvenience. She didn't have the luxury of ignoring it, not after all the work she had put in over the years. She was used to being the backbone of Project Nourish, making decisions every day that affected thousands of families in need. Yet here she was, facing a minor infraction that seemed completely out of proportion to the bigger picture of her life. As she walked toward her car, Tasha couldn't help but think about the work she did. Project Nourish wasn't just a food program. It was a lifeline to communities that often went unnoticed, especially in marginalized neighborhoods. It provided fresh food, resources, and educational support to families who were struggling with food insecurity. She had spent years building relationships with local farmers, national food distributors, and government agencies to make sure that fresh produce reached those who needed it most. The program's reach spanned across the country, touching lives in ways that many would never see or understand. But for all her efforts, there were always moments like this one, moments where it felt like she was being judged for the wrong reasons, dismissed without consideration of the bigger impact she was making. Tasha had become accustomed to these small moments of injustice, the kind that never made headlines but were quietly insidious. Whether it was dealing with dismissive officials or bureaucratic red tape, she always found a way to rise above it. But today felt different. There was something about the way Judge Hughes had passed down that fine, so quickly, so matter-of-factly, that gnawed at her. It wasn't just the money. It was the idea that someone who had dedicated her life to serving others, Someone who had worked tirelessly to ensure people didn't go hungry could be reduced to a simple case in a crowded courtroom, her life and achievements invisible to the very system she was working to improve. She got into her car and sat for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. She could hear the voices of the family she had helped over the years. The single mothers, the elderly couples, the children who had walked into food pantries with nothing but hope in their eyes. Project Nourish had fed them, given them more than just meals. It had given them dignity, a sense of community, and the knowledge that they mattered. Yet here she was, overlooked by the very system that had failed so many of those people. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back from her thoughts. It was a reminder about a meeting with her team. She sighed, wiping away a tear that had escaped her eyes, and started the car. There was no time to dwell on this moment, not when so many people were counting on her to keep moving forward. Amy Collins was no stranger to digging deep for a story, but when she first caught wind of Tasha Wright's name, she didn't know the significance behind it. A local reporter for the Riverton Chronicle, Amy had seen her fair share of small-town court cases, and the fine Tasha had been slapped with barely seemed noteworthy. But something about it piqued her curiosity. The name Tasha Wright rang a bell, yet Amy couldn't immediately place why. After all, it was a simple fine for an administrative oversight, hardly the kind of case that usually made headlines. However, something didn't sit right with Amy. As she skimmed the courthouse records and Tasha's public information, a detail jumped out: Project Nourish. The name clicked. Amy had heard about the initiative in passing, a program aimed at alleviating hunger for underserved communities across the region. But she didn't know much about it. Until now. Intrigued, Amy decided to investigate further. She dug into articles, nonprofit databases, and even called a few local community leaders who had worked with Tasha. The more she uncovered, the more her jaw dropped. Tasha wasn't just running a small local program. Project Nourish was a nationwide initiative, backed by the federal government, which had helped thousands of families access nutritious food. It wasn't just about giving away meals. It was a comprehensive system that addressed food insecurity, provided education about healthy eating, and connected people to job opportunities through partnerships with local farmers and businesses. Tasha was at the helm, and her influence reached further than anyone had realized. Amy was stunned by the contrast. Here was a woman who had been quietly shifting the landscape of food security in the country, leading a program that impacted communities on a national scale, yet she had been dismissed so casually in court. The fine had seemed trivial to most people, but now it felt like a huge oversight, a system that didn't recognize the full extent of someone's contribution. Amy knew that Tasha's story was more than just about a fine. It was about what people like her faced every day, the invisible barriers that prevented them from being seen for who they truly were. Determined to shed light on the truth, Amy began writing her story. She reached out to Tasha for an interview, hoping to understand her perspective and give the public a glimpse into the life of a woman who had quietly become a force for change. As Amy drafted her piece, she realized just how much was at stake, not just for Tasha, but for everyone who was making an impact without getting the recognition they deserved. The story had to be told, not just for the sake of Tasha, but to open people's eyes to the power of the unsung heroes among them. As Amy's story took shape, it was clear. Tasha Wright's case was about more than a fine. It was about an unrecognized champion who had been overlooked by the very system she worked tirelessly to improve. Judge Thomas Hughes had been in the business long enough to know how quickly a story could catch fire, but he wasn't prepared for what happened the day Amy Collins' article went live. He sat down with his morning coffee like any other day, flicking through the local news on his tablet. His eyes skimmed the headlines until one caught his attention. Local woman fined in court is behind nationwide food security program. He clicked the link. His interest piqued, not realizing how much his life was about to shift. As the words on the screen began to unfold, a sudden sense of recognition flooded over him. The name Tasha Wright had already begun to feel familiar from earlier in the day, but it wasn't until he read the story that the weight of it hit him. Tasha wasn't just anyone. She was the director of Project Nourish, a highly regarded initiative that had transformed food access in low-income communities across the country. His mind raced as he absorbed the details. The program had distributed millions of pounds of fresh produce, partnered with thousands of farmers, and provided support to individuals struggling with food insecurity. A pit began to form in his stomach. The woman he'd dismissed so quickly in his courtroom was at the center of something far bigger than he'd ever realized. He could almost feel the sting of his own assumptions. Why hadn't I known this? He thought, a sense of unease creeping over him. He had passed judgment on Tasha with little more than a glance, treating her case as if it were like any other, without considering her real-life impact. What he had seen as an insignificant fine for an administrative issue had, in hindsight, felt wrong, dismissing someone whose work had changed lives. The article also mentioned something that struck him even harder. Tasha had used her platform not only to feed families, but to help communities build sustainability. She wasn't just fixing short-term problems. She was shaping long-term solutions. Yet in the courtroom that morning, he had treated her as just another name on the docket, ignoring the depth of her work and influence. Judge Hughes leaned back in his chair, the weight of the realization settling heavily on his shoulders. His first instinct was to dismiss his mistake. After all, he was just doing his job, wasn't he? But as he sat there, he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth. He had failed to see the full picture. He had let his biases, perhaps even a momentary lapse in attention, cloud his judgment. He had made a snap decision without knowing anything about the woman in front of him. As the day wore on, the unease inside him grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had done more than just issue a fine. He had underestimated someone whose actions were having a profound impact on the world. And as that thought lingered, Judge Hughes found himself asking a question that would stay with him. How many other times had he made similar judgments without looking deeper? It was clear now. He had to make this right. News of Tasha Wright's courtroom encounter spread faster than anyone had anticipated. Amy Collins' article went viral, making waves both locally and nationally. The headline, "Local Woman Fined in Court is Behind Nationwide Food Security Program," drew the attention of people from all walks of life. Tasha's name was suddenly everywhere, on social media, in blogs, and even in national news outlets. What had been a simple case of an administrative error had now turned into a public spectacle. The response was overwhelming. Community leaders and food security advocates began speaking out, rallying behind Tasha. Her supporters flooded social media with messages of solidarity, sharing their admiration for her work and denouncing the unfair treatment she had received. The hashtag #JusticeForTasha trended across Twitter as thousands voiced their support, demanding an apology from Judge Hughes and a revaluation of the fine. People felt a deep injustice on her behalf, not just because of the fine, but because of how easily someone like Tasha had been overlooked by the very system she had dedicated her life to improving. Tasha, for her part, was stunned by the outpouring of support. She had always been focused on her mission, Project Nourish, and had never sought the spotlight. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, let alone in the middle of a controversy like this. Her phone rang constantly with reporters, activists, and even politicians wanting to speak with her. Some of them expressed their anger over how she'd been treated, while others offered their admiration for her achievements. But amid all the noise, Tasha felt a quiet resolve settle over her. She wasn't going to let this incident define her or the work she had done. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized something profound. This wasn't just about her. It was about a broken system that had failed to recognize the value of people who worked behind the scenes to make real change. One afternoon, as Tasha sat in her office reading through the hundreds of messages of support, a call came in. It was from a local activist group that had begun organizing a rally outside the courthouse. They were demanding accountability from Judge Hughes and urging the local government to review how cases like hers were handled. The group wanted Tasha to speak at the rally. Tasha hesitated for a moment. She wasn't someone who liked to make waves. She was used to being the quiet force behind the scenes, focused on her mission to feed families and build sustainable solutions. But then she thought about all the people who had reached out to her, the single mothers, the children, the elderly, all of them counting on the success of Project Nourish. This was bigger than one courtroom. It was about visibility, recognition, and fairness. She knew what she had to do. With a deep breath, Tasha agreed. She would speak out, not just for herself, but for everyone whose contributions went unnoticed. It was time for her to take the platform and use it to challenge the very system that had failed her that day. A few days after the rally, Tasha sat at her desk, her mind whirling with the momentum of the public support she had received. She was gearing up for another busy week with Project Nourish. But the events of the past few days continued to weigh on her. The rally had been a powerful statement, a moment where her voice, amplified by the voices of so many others, had been heard. Yet, despite the outpouring of support, there was a part of her that wanted the story to fade, to go back to focusing on the work that mattered. She hadn't sought this attention, but now that it was here, she was determined to use it for good. It was late in the afternoon when the phone rang. Tasha answered, expecting to hear from one of her colleagues or a reporter. But the voice on the other end was unexpected. "Ms. Wright, this is Judge Thomas Hughes. I'd like to meet with you, if you're willing," he said, his tone uncharacteristically humble. Tasha's eyebrows furrowed. She wasn't sure what to make of this. After everything that had happened, the idea of meeting with the judge seemed strange. But there was something in his voice, an earnestness, that made her pause. After a brief silence, she agreed to meet. They arranged a time for the next day. When Tasha arrived at the courthouse the following afternoon, she was greeted by the judge himself. He stood in front of his office, his usual composed demeanor replaced by a quiet unease. He motioned for her to come in, and they sat across from each other. The room, often filled with authority and decision-making, now felt different, more vulnerable. "I owe you an apology," Judge Hughes began, his voice steady but carrying a sense of regret. "I made a mistake. I didn't take the time to understand who you were or what you do. I saw your case as just another administrative issue, without considering the real impact you've had on this community and this country. I want to apologize for that." Tasha remained calm as she listened, her expression neutral but not cold. She had expected a formal apology, but hearing him speak so genuinely caught her off guard. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, something that hadn't been there when he first imposed the fine. "I understand your apology," she said after a moment. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the systems we live in, the assumptions we make about people without knowing their full story. I'm grateful that you've taken the time to realize that, but we both know this goes beyond one mistake in a courtroom. It's about how easily people, especially those from marginalized communities, are dismissed or overlooked by the very structures that are supposed to serve them." Judge Hughes nodded thoughtfully. "You're right," he said. "I should have listened more carefully. I see now that I didn't do that. I want to make this right, not just for you, but for everyone whose work goes unrecognized." Tasha took a deep breath, feeling a sense of resolution in the air between them. The apology was a start, but she knew the work ahead wasn't just about one moment of accountability. It was about shifting the way people saw each other and themselves. The meeting between Tasha and Judge Hughes had been a turning point. The apology, while meaningful, was just the beginning. Tasha left the courthouse that afternoon with a sense of clarity. She knew that the real work had to go beyond individual apologies or public support. It was about shifting the broader narrative, changing the way people saw her, her work, and others who quietly made a difference in their communities. In the weeks that followed, the public conversation about Tasha and Project Nourish only grew. The story of how an overlooked fine had sparked a national conversation about food insecurity and systemic biases gained traction. More people began to ask questions about the structures in place that allowed hardworking, influential people like Tasha to be ignored or dismissed. It wasn't just about one courtroom mistake. It was about a larger issue that affected countless others, often invisibly. Tasha was invited to speak at conferences, town halls, and even on national talk shows. As she shared her story, she made it clear that her fight wasn't just for recognition, but for fairness and equality in systems that were designed to help, but often failed those who needed it most. She spoke about the deep-rooted issues of hunger and poverty that Project Nourish worked to address, but she also highlighted the challenges of navigating systems that weren't built with people like her in mind. Her message was simple but powerful. People who worked on the front lines of social change needed to be seen, heard, and valued, not just for what they did, but for the impact they created. Judge Hughes, too, became a part of the conversation in an unexpected way. He publicly acknowledged the mistake he had made, and while some saw his apology as an act of personal growth, others saw it as a symbol of a larger shift. In the following weeks, he advocated for the creation of programs to better educate court officials on the role that nonprofits, like Project Nourish, played in their communities. He worked with local advocacy groups to raise awareness of the biases embedded in the judicial system that led to decisions being made without full understanding. Even though the ripple effect of Tasha's story had already begun to change public perception, it also started to inspire others to speak up. More and more individuals in the nonprofit sector and beyond began sharing their experiences, discussing the barriers they faced in being seen or heard. The conversation around food insecurity, community activism, and justice became more nuanced and thoughtful. It wasn't just about charity. It was about giving people the dignity they deserved and recognizing their contributions to society. For Tasha, though, the most fulfilling part of it all was knowing that the ripple she had started would continue to spread. The story wasn't just hers. It was the story of every person working tirelessly, unseen and unheard, for the betterment of their communities. And now, they were all finally being seen. Months had passed since the courtroom incident and the events that followed, and Tasha Wright had found herself in a place of unexpected peace. What began as a simple mistake, a fine for a minor oversight, had led to a transformation, not just in the way people viewed her, but in the broader conversation about social justice, food security, and systemic inequalities. The ripple effect she had hoped for was real, and she was no longer just a name on a court docket or a face behind Project Nourish. She had become a symbol of resilience, of the quiet leaders whose work, while often invisible, shaped the very fabric of their communities. Project Nourish was thriving. Thanks to the heightened awareness, donations had increased, partnerships had expanded, and more government agencies had begun to invest in long-term food security programs. Tasha's team had grown, and they now operated in more cities, serving a wider range of families. Yet, despite all the progress, Tasha remained grounded, always remembering the countless individuals she had met over the years, families who had been given not just food, but hope and opportunities for a better future. The impact of the national conversation was profound, but Tasha wasn't focused on the spotlight. She was focused on what she had always been focused on: creating lasting change. She knew that there were still deep, systemic issues to address. But now, thanks to the attention drawn by her case, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had seen firsthand how a small moment of recognition could ignite powerful change, and she was determined to keep pushing forward. One afternoon, as she walked into her office, Tasha was greeted with a surprise. A framed photograph was sitting on her desk. It was a picture of her, standing with a group of children, holding bags of fresh produce. They were smiling, their faces full of hope. Beneath the photograph was a plaque that read, "In recognition of your tireless work in building a healthier, more just world." The plaque had been presented to her by a local organization that had long admired her efforts, but had never found a way to show their appreciation until now. It was a simple gesture, but for Tasha, it meant everything. She smiled as she ran her fingers along the plaque. It wasn't just an award. It was a reminder that her work mattered, that the people she served mattered. It was a quiet victory, the kind that couldn't be measured by the size of the crowds or the headlines, but one that spoke volumes about the power of compassion and commitment. Tasha sat down at her desk, took a deep breath, and looked at the photo again. She had fought for recognition, yes, but more than that, she had fought for the dignity of others. And in the end, that was the greatest reward of all. She knew the journey was far from over, but she also knew she was no longer alone. Her work, and the voices of those who supported her, would continue to echo, creating a legacy of lasting change for generations to come.